My lady, may I call Mr. John Swinney, please?
Certainly, Ms. Tobin.
Good afternoon, sir. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay, can I ask, will you be swearing on the Bible or taking the affirmation?
I'll be swearing on the Bible.
Okay, thank you. If you could hold the Bible in your hand, please, right hand, and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Mr. Swinney, thank you for coming back to help us. I'm sorry, there seem to be some technical problems, hence the slight delay in starting you. Make sure we finish you this afternoon, I promise.
Okay, thank you, my lady.
Mr. Swinney, can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
My name is John Ramsey Swinney.
And Mr. Swinney, I think you have in front of you a statement that bears the number INQ 000588143.
I do.
And are you content that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I am.
Mr. Swinney, I think it's right that you're currently the First Minister of Scotland.
I am.
And that you were the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills from 2016 to May 2021.
I was.
And that you were the Cabinet Secretary for COVID Recovery from May 2021 to March 2023.
That is correct.
And that you were the Deputy First Minister in addition to those responsibilities from 2014 to March 2023. Is that correct?
That is also correct.
Thank you. Mr. Swinney, in your statement, you're critical of the United Kingdom government on a number of points and at various places. I don't think I need to take you to them specifically, but at paragraphs 20, 23, 24, 29 and paragraph 30. But coming to paragraph 30, you say that you had no concerns in relation to the approach that the UK government took to education and the care of children and young people. Is that right?
That is correct.
And is that because you made largely the same decisions as your counterpart for the United Kingdom government?
We made similar decisions, but there would obviously be variations in timescales where we did certain things in different ways at different times. But fundamentally, we recognised that the approaches that we had to take in relation to the collective effort to contain the pandemic required us to undertake decisions in relation to schools, particularly, and other educational institutions that were decisions we would rather not have had to have taken.
All right, well, we'll come on to those decisions, but in any event, education is an entirely devolved matter, isn't it?
It is, yes.
That is true also of children's social care, correct?
That is correct, yes.
You also make the point on a number of occasions throughout your statement that local authorities in Scotland are responsible for the provision of education, social care and social work, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Responsible for local education policy, correct?
Correct, yes.
The provision of school education, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Improving outcomes.
That's correct, yes.
The statutory duty to reduce inequalities.
Yes, that's correct.
And also that it's for local authorities to determine how best to ensure continuity of service provision to vulnerable children as well. Is that also right?
That's correct, yes.
But it is the Scottish Government, isn't it, which bears ultimate responsibility for the education of Scottish children. Is that also correct?
That is correct, yes.
And it's also the Scottish Government that bears ultimate responsibility for their safety as well, correct?
That's correct, yes.
In the lessons learned section of your statement, Mr. Swinney, that ranges over some 41 paragraphs, it's difficult to identify anything that you or the Scottish Government thinks that it could have done better for children. Is that correct?
I think we undertook a series of decisions that were dealing with an unprecedented set of circumstances, and we took the best decisions available to us at the time to protect the well-being of children and to ensure that their education and their welfare was supported by our actions.
The question I asked you was a different one. In your statement, there are 41 paragraphs about lessons learned, and it's difficult to identify amongst those 41 paragraphs what the lessons learned, what those lessons learned are. And I'm asking you directly, do you have any lessons or anything that you think could have been improved upon that the Scottish Government did?
I think what I tried to do in the lessons learned section is highlight the difference perhaps between the approach that was taken on some issues, for example, in 2020, when we faced the first onset of the pandemic, and then what we subsequently did when we faced further periods of restrictions and lockdown in 2021. So, for example, I think the promotion of the availability of remote learning and access to remote learning was far stronger in 2021 than it had been in 2020. So it's one tangible example of where I think we did things differently and we improved on what had been able to be delivered in 2020. So I think what I've tried to do in that section is to highlight areas where we reflected on our performance and tried to improve the way in which we handled the situation.
Perhaps if we could go to that section of your witness statement, and this is at page 143, and it starts with paragraph 568. That's INQ 000588143. And I think in the first paragraph of that section, you say, I believe that my decisions at the time were firmly located within and enabled by the strong commitment across the Scottish Government to a human rights-based approach to legislation and policy, including in relation to young people. Does that stand for all the decisions that you made during the pandemic in relation to children and young people?
I would contend so, yes.
Right. And can I also please go, whilst we're in this section, to paragraph, is it 594, please? Mr. Swinney, this is the closest that appeared to be a reflection on things that could have gone better. At 594, you state, I would also reflect that I think it would have been preferable if in the initial phases of school closures, we had been able to more quickly put in place a national e-learning offer with a clear statement of the support and entitlements available to all learners at all stages and all ages and their families. Is that the height of the insight that you provide, that it would have been preferable in school closures that you'd been able to move more quickly? Is that it?
I think that is I think an important observation on where we had to move in a very fast-moving situation in March of 2020 to put in place arrangements which were able to deliver in the best circumstances we could at that time the continuity of education for children and young people in Scotland. Now, it's a very complicated piece of work to put in place because it involves us exercising that responsibility or trying to enable that across schools the length and breadth of the country, probably the best part of over 2,000 schools in Scotland, working through 32 local authorities. And we had in place some foundations for that. So the GLOW system is a system of electronic access to learning that's available to every pupil in Scotland, and that was available at the start of the pandemic. We had other measures such as the investment that had been made in the eSchool, which was a virtual education platform. And of course that complemented what was being undertaken by individual schools, the length and breadth of the country, to try to provide learning directly, classroom teacher by classroom teacher, to children and young people around the country. So essentially we were trying to put in place a method of ensuring continuity of education when we were in circumstances where the model of education had changed very dramatically because children were not able to have access to school buildings in the way to which we would ordinarily be familiar.
I think that seems like a very long answer. And I think the answer is that is the height of your insight, yes?
Well, it's certainly my reflection on where we'd reached at that time, yes.
Right. Going back then to the decision to close schools to most children in Scotland, Mr. Swinney, were you conscious when you made that decision of the enormity of it for all children of school age in Scotland?
Yes, it was a decision I would rather not have had to have taken.
And what did you see what did you foresee the consequences of that decision being?
I certainly, at the time, thought there was an inevitable interruption to the continuity of education that young people were experiencing. And I was also conscious of the potential damage to the well-being of children and young people, given the fact that formal schooling occupies such a central part of the access to learning and to support for young people in our education system.
And all of those consequences are entirely foreseeable, aren't they? They don't require any special insight or understanding to arrive at them.
I don't think that's necessary.
Paragraph 24 of your statement, you said that you had access to SAGE papers, conclusions and advice. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And did you read those papers, conclusions and advice yourself, or were they distilled for you?
They would be a combination of both. Sometimes I would look at the material myself. On other occasions, I would be receiving briefing papers that were drawing on SAGE information, and in some circumstances I may be benefiting from the communication of SAGE discussions and papers through, for example, the contribution of the Chief Medical Officer perhaps to Cabinet discussions or other discussions that we might have. And
at what point in time did you start to have access to SAGE papers and the advice that you've just referred to?
I think it would be difficult for me to give a definitive point on that, but I certainly was. I think I could confidently say in early March, but it might have been before that.
All right, because at paragraph 35 of your statement, you've referred to the fact that on the 17th of February, thank you very much, that there was an update on the reasonable worst-case scenario modelling from the United Kingdom government, correct? And
yes,
it included a reference to the potential impact of widespread school closures, yes?
Yes.
And that is right, isn't it, Mr. Swinney? By this stage in February, SAGE was contemplating the potential epidemiological impact of closing schools, wasn't it?
That's correct, yes.
And I think that it follows from what you say at paragraph 36 of your statement, that in fact in Scotland this was something that was already in mind, yes?
Yes.
And that some work was being undertaken at that time to consider contingency planning, yes?
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, it was recognised that this might be needed at this point in time in Scotland, yes?
Correct, yes.
And can you explain then, this is somewhere around the middle of February, what the Scottish Government then did in order to act on this understanding from SAGE that there might be mass school closures?
we began to engage in discussion with the various parties that are key interlocutors in the leading of Scottish education thereafter. So in my statement at paragraph 38, it makes reference to a dialogue from my officials with senior staff in the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, the Association of Directors of Education and the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives and Senior Managers, because in the context of any issues in relation to Scottish education, whilst going back to some of our earlier exchanges, the Scottish Government carries ultimate responsibility for education policy. In terms of the delivery in schools around the country, local authorities are absolutely critical interlocutors because they carry the statutory responsibility for the delivery of education. So what that approach recognises is the need for the government to work in cooperation and collaboration with our local authority partners. And after those discussions, we were engaged in wider discussion with our local authority partners and other stakeholders in education on this question.
So I think 2 points follow from that, Mr. Swinney. The first is the Scottish Government isn't a passive bystander, is it, in planning for school closures? It had a fundamental role to play in that planning, didn't it?
Yes, it certainly did, yes.
And that's despite the fact that schools and local authorities have the operational responsibility for the actual delivery of education, yes?
That's correct.
All right, so can we look at what happened then in light of that? And I think you set out, we can see from paragraph 38 onwards, I don't think we need to go through each of these paragraphs, but there were some meetings, and I think we come to paragraph 37, please, that there was a meeting on the 27th of February to discuss preparedness in the education sector, correct? And what was the state of preparedness at that point?
I think it would be fair to say that we were in the early stages of contemplating what this might look like. I come back to one of the comments that I made before. None of us embarked on this period in any way enthusiastic about school closures. It was frankly the last thing we wanted to contemplate. So we were beginning to come to the realisation at that stage that this may be a very real prospect that we had to contemplate. And the preparations would be to answer the question the consideration of preparations was at a very early stage.
All right, so this is notwithstanding the sorts of information that SAGE had been providing during February. By the 27th of February, the Scottish Government was only starting to contemplate the reality of what that might entail. Is that correct?
I think that's a fair summary, yes.
All right. So on the 27th, you have a meeting, and I think then if we go ahead a few paragraphs to paragraph 40, you said that you spoke to COSLA on planning and the need to ensure emphasis on education and social care in local plans, given the ramifications of the reasonable worst-case scenario.
That's correct, yeah.
So what were the ramifications of that you were concerned about and needed to discuss with COSLA?
There would obviously be a significant disruption to the existing models of the delivery of education and social care services in Scotland. So the conversation that I would be having with Councillor Evison as the president of COSLA would be across a wider range of implications, more at the relationship between government and local government, but it would obviously draw heavily on issues in relation to education and social care as the principal areas of interaction.
So when it says the need to ensure an emphasis on education and social care in local plans, that relates to the plans that they were generating rather than the plans that Scottish Government was generating, correct?
I think I would tend to characterise this interaction as a joint endeavour. But what I was very keen to do. It's actually been something that's been an approach I've taken in all my ministerial life, is to recognise where you have a situation, and it's well illustrated on the question of education, where the Scottish Government has absolute responsibility for the delivery of education. It's an entirely devolved function, but operationally, the statutory responsibility rests with the individual local authorities for the delivery of that education in their area. We need to work very much in a collaborative environment. So it's not a case of them and us. It's a case of us working together to try to work through some really difficult territory, and particularly in relation to some of the issues that we were wrestling with here.
So what was the Scottish Government's contribution at this stage? I mean, you're emphasising to local authorities that they need to put an emphasis on education and care and local plans. What was the Scottish Government's contribution?
We'd be exploring how we worked with and supported local authorities in that endeavour, and how organisations responsible to the Scottish Government, such as Education Scotland, for example, could contribute to supporting local authorities in the delivery of education should that situation arise.
So you're having a dialogue with them saying, how can we support you if school closures, if mass school closures or isolated school closures are going to occur? Is that right?
Yes, that would be a fair characterisation of it.
And what were they telling you? What was the other side of this dialogue? What did they need from Scottish Government?
They were. I think it'd be fair to say, anxious about the situation and looking for guidance about what steps to take if we were to fast forward to the eventual decision to close schools, and the eventual decision was made at a national level, but it was informed by a dialogue with local authorities about what was the right thing to do in that context, because the issue about taking a decision about school closures is not ordinarily, it wouldn't be a decision for the Education Secretary or the government to take, because statute essentially places that responsibility for a school closure at local level. But our local authorities were looking for guidance and assurance that we were working together and collaboratively to the same agenda, so that we avoided a situation where there might be, for example, an approach taken in one local authority area that might conflict with an approach taken in another local authority area. And what we were trying to do was to provide essentially a collective understanding of what we were wrestling with and how collectively we could navigate our way through a really difficult situation.
So I think you've said they were looking for guidance, and that part of the reason for that and why that would be important is to ensure consistency of approach, correct?
Yes.
And that consistency of approach is critical, isn't it, in order to ensure that children are treated fairly as well, yes?
That's correct.
And did the Scottish Government issue any guidance at around this stage, or provide any of the support that was being sought at this point?
We did, and I think there was a letter from, I think one of the specific documents in front of me, I think, relates to a letter around about the 4th of March from one of my officials to local authorities, which was opening up some, essentially beginning to establish how we might all approach these questions.
So let's go to that then. That's at INQ 000520406. And we can see, can't we, Mr. Swinney, that this is a letter that's addressed to directors of education, local authority, chief executives, unions, and to the schools themselves, yes?
That's correct, yeah.
And I think we can tell from the first sentence of that letter that it's being sent on your behalf.
It is, yes.
And can I just ask, at this point in time, did schools and local authorities, were they party to the SAGE advice as well?
I doubt schools would be, and I think if local authorities had access to SAGE information, it would be through the sharing of that advice via the Scottish Government. I can't think that they would have a direct access to that.
No.
That was the case.
No, I mean, really, it's just about trying to understand what these schools would know in order to be entering into dialogue with you, in order to be able to help inform planning.
Well, in a sense, at that time, we were all consuming information about the developing situation from a wide variety of sources, and some would be available more formally to government than would be available to others. Indeed, there would be a sharing of information to the best of our ability. But I think there would be a lack of certainty about what was all involved at that stage and what was likely to be involved. But the letter that was issued from my officials on the 4th of March on my behalf to directors of education and others would be designed to signal our willingness and our keenness to engage those parties in how we worked together on what was going to be a collective endeavour.
That's understood, Mr. Swinney, but you were the person who had the benefit of the SAGE advice, the advice from the CMO and the other forms of specialist advice that were available to you as a senior member of the Scottish Government, yes?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And the people to whom this letter is sent, they didn't have that access, did they?
No, I don't think they would have.
So if we look at the first paragraph and what it is that you're asking them, it sets out here, I would therefore be grateful for your support in a number of areas to ensure that there is a clear national understanding of what is happening across all education settings. This will help inform national planning and the development of any further guidance. So this isn't the Scottish Government explaining to schools what's happening, for example, in terms of the advice that's being provided. This is you asking schools what's happening.
It's about creating a collaborative environment, is how I would describe it. It's us indicating that we recognise we've got a very serious threat that we are facing, and there is a need for us to work together in that endeavour. So,
I mean, when you asked them what's happening, what were you asking them to tell you?
It would be about any arrangements that would be made in schools that might potentially interrupt learning. If I have my dates correct, I think not long after the issuing of this letter, there would have been an outbreak of COVID in Shetland, which had a significant impact on the sustainability of schools, and therefore that would be a material issue that government would want to know about to try to help to ensure constancy of support and assistance in advancing a response to that situation.
So I think it's right, Mr. Swinney, isn't it? I mean, I don't think this is in dispute. COVID was in Scotland by this stage, wasn't it? The announcement of the first case, I think, was made on the 1st of March.
Yes.
Yeah, so you knew it had arrived and you knew that advice had been provided now for some time that there might be mass school closures. And I think, is it right, this is your first significant piece of correspondence with schools and the other authorities to which this is addressed about the pandemic, correct?
Probably the formal communication, but there would have been informal communication that was taken forward, or follow-up conversations. If I refer back to my statement, the I think there were, if you forgive me one moment, I think there were follow-up conversations after the meeting on the 27th of February that I convened. So there would be dialogue would have started
Yes.
approximately a week before that.
Yes, no, I'm not suggesting there wasn't dialogue. I'm pointing to the fact this appears to have been the first formal communication, as you say, and I think you yourself have suggested in evidence that this was significant, because when I asked you about planning, this is the letter that you pointed to.
Yes.
And if we look on page 2, thank you, we can see that at the bottom of this page that you identify that a key issue for many schools and parents over coming months will be planned school trips overseas and receiving appropriate health advice as to whether or not these trips should go ahead.
That's correct, yeah.
So again, despite the fact that COVID-19 was in Scotland, there doesn't seem to be any understanding on your part that issues like overseas travel were now, becoming completely, vanishingly unlikely and unrealistic. No?
Well, I think the pointing out of these points to schools is essentially, drawing the attention of schools to the advice that's available from the recognised sources, whether it's NHS Inform or the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, about these questions. Now, I accept that we were not saying at that stage, do not do this. But in a sense, what we are doing in this communication is raising with schools the relevant issues that they have to consider, and with local authorities about relevant issues to be considered in that respect.
Forgive me, Mr. Swinney, I think I meant rather more that this doesn't impart any urgency or any sense of the gravity of the position that schools were now facing. Because you can't really impart that and, on the other hand, be suggesting to schools that one of the most serious issues they might be thinking about is overseas school trips.
Well, I would suggest that the gravity is illustrated by the contents of paragraph 1 of the letter, where we say that the situation continues to develop rapidly, and it will be important we work together closely to contain, delay and mitigate the impact of the virus. And that represents a reflection of where the government's actions were at that time.
I see. Can we go over the page, please, to contingency planning? Thank you. This sets out, and I think this must be when you referred earlier in your evidence to this demonstrating the Scottish Government's contribution to planning. You set out, we're working closely. I'm afraid I don't know what the SNCT is. You might be able to help me.
It's the SNCT is the negotiating forum between the Scottish Government, local authorities and the teaching trade unions around terms and working conditions within the education system. So it's a negotiating body between those that tripartite arrangement. So any discussions, for example, about pay for teachers is carried out in that forum. Any discussion about terms and conditions, staff well-being, for example, is carried out on that tripartite basis in the SNCT.
I understand. And the SQA, I think we know, is the Scottish Qualifications Authority, correct?
That's correct, yes.
So you go on to say you will want to ensure you are making appropriate contingency plans locally. Part of this may include GLOW, Scotland's nationally available digital learning platform. Learners and teachers can access all tools and features of this anytime on any device with an internet connection. I'll come to whether that was realistic in one moment. But But the point, you will want to ensure you are making appropriate contingency plans locally. What were you even suggesting to schools they should be making contingency plans for?
They might be increasing the volume of material and that might be available for use through the digital platform of Glow, or how they might essentially be preparing educational materials that could be utilised on that platform to minimise the disruption of education for children and young people.
Forgive me, Mr. Swinney. Are you asking them to prepare for mass school closures, isolated school closures, staff absences, pupil absences, the maintenance of child protection? It doesn't say anywhere what it is that they're actually supposed to be making these plans for.
But I think what the document goes on to talk about the digital learning platform Glow and the different ways in which educational services can be continued should there be a difficulty in pupils or staff being unable to attend school. And that was a recognition that at that stage we did not know definitively what situation we might have to be dealing with. But if there was, for example, pupils who had COVID and who were unable to go to school, that their education could be sustained on an isolated basis by using Glow, because there'd be materials available to allow them to continue that education. From that individual isolated example to a more comprehensive example about a wholesale closure of the school estate as a consequence of COVID.
The emphasis again is on what schools and local authorities will be doing, correct? You will want to ensure you're making appropriate contingency plans locally. Where was the Scottish Government's role in making contingency plans? Where was its support at this point?
Well, its support would be essentially through the means of communication that we are talking about just now, because going back to the structure of Scottish education, we rely on local authorities to manage the delivery of education in 32 distinct local authority areas in Scotland. Indeed, it's not that we rely upon that, that's what statute requires of us. So the operation of education at local level is not carried out by the government, it's carried out by schools. And what we're doing here is essentially providing advice and guidance about how that can be sustained during a period of interruption to the continuity of education. And then there would be the role that Education Scotland would be taking on behalf as a Scottish Government agency, taking forward in their interaction with local authorities and schools and supporting the delivery of education at local level, which is part of their remit.
Mr. Swinney, there's no guidance in this. You're saying to them you'll want to ensure you're making appropriate contingency plans. You're not providing them with any guidance as to what might be required if schools have to close their doors to most of their pupils.
Well,
there's nothing like that in this letter.
I think we go on to say that in the later parts of that paragraph about the steps and the techniques that are available to ensure the continuity of education, because if there was to be a period in which individuals were not able to attend school, or there was to be a period in which schools were to be closed, then there had to be alternative means of delivering education. And this is the government pointing to resources and approaches that could be taken in that respect.
So let's look at that. Learners and teachers can access all the tools and features at any time on any device with an internet connection. This can help learning to continue outside the classroom in a variety of ways when pupils or staff are unable to attend school during events such as school closures. And then you go on to say that a username and a password is needed. The first point is, yes, children could access that if they had a device. Yes?
That's correct, yes.
Obviously, this letter, it raises no question, does it? It doesn't provide any guidance. It doesn't ask any questions, for example, about what access children have to devices. It doesn't ask schools to start, for example, gathering information about what access children have to devices. That's the sort of guidance that might have been expected at this point, Mr. Swinney, no?
There'd be a variation around the country in some of the steps that would be available here. In some local authorities, for example, there would be some local authorities have gone down the route of providing devices to every pupil as part of the learning proposition in their areas. And again, that's within each local authority's entitlement to take such an action. There would be, but as other events have demonstrated, we went on to provide much more digital access as a consequence of the experience that we had, and those arrangements were incrementally built up, and indeed that would be one of my reflections about the provision in 2021 as opposed to in 2020, that by that stage we'd made much greater headway in making sure there was an availability of digital infrastructure to enable that to be the case. But I would accept that at that stage we did not have a complete picture, nor did we have nationwide delivery of digital devices to enable that to be the case.
No, Mr. Swinney, you hadn't asked any of the basic questions that a government would need to ask in order to implement any sort of planning or guidance to schools as how to deal with, for example, the digital divide. That's right, isn't it?
But the fundamental point that we're raising there is about the importance of the delivery of education being, a priority being attached to ensuring the continuity of the delivery of education in very challenging circumstances.
Right, Mr. Swinney, I'm going to keep on with the issue of planning and what the Scottish Government did. I think, and I don't think we need to go to this, you set out in your witness statement at paragraph 45 that there was further analysis by stage about the contribution that school closures might make to meeting the pandemic, and that on the 9th of March you asked for advice about the likely impact of school closures. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And I think if we go to this is INQ 0000182 838, please. Is this the first time that you had asked for advice as to the likely impact of school closures?
It would be the first time, yes.
And why did you wait until the 9th of March to ask for this advice?
Well, let me just for completeness, I think the issues of the potential for closures, I think, were aired in late February, particularly around the 27th of February. But we would still be dealing with an emerging speculation about whether or not that would be likely. But this would perhaps be the first formal request for advice that I would have asked in relation to the question of school closures.
So I think, Mr. Swinney, if we just look at the first page of this document, please, we can see that you sought it urgent. You wanted it ahead of a COBRA meeting at 2:30, yes?
That's right, yeah.
And it would appear that at paragraph 3, it set out that the current understanding is that widespread school closures are not part of the measures that the UK government is currently considering, yes?
Correct.
But that didn't mean that they weren't in prospect. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree with that, but I think the sense that I had at the time was that the United Kingdom government had as little enthusiasm for school closures as I had.
Yes.
So we were, I think the United Kingdom government at the time was taking much the same view as I was taking, which was I would rather avoid this if I possibly could do.
Yes.
And which I think that text is a fair representation of the fact that this was not a preferred scenario or anything like it.
Yes, I think that gives rise to 2 points, Mr. Swinney. The first one must be trying to do everything to avoid school closures, and what it was that you were doing at this point in time to avoid that eventuality from becoming a reality. So can you identify what you were actually doing then to prevent this from happening?
I think what we were doing then was trying to take forward the wider measures within society, which were, I think, are narrated in this paragraph about the isolation of symptomatic cases, whole household isolation, social distancing, and the other measures of that type, which were designed at that time to avoid the spread of the virus to such an extent that it would require much more, the type of the contemplation of some of the options that we then had to contemplate.
So this wasn't about thinking about what could actually be done inside schools themselves in order to be able to keep them open. So this wasn't about, for example, consideration of social distancing in school or the use of alternative venues in order to be able to keep schools open on a longer term basis.
I do remember at different stages contemplating, but it tended to be later in the pandemic, contemplating the use of wider facilities to try to sustain education. But I think at this stage we were looking at wider societal factors to try to avoid school closures, and that was about trying to slow up the spread of the virus.
I'm just going to go back, Mr. Swinney, to the second point that you made just there, which was about you and the UK government being of one mind in terms of really not wanting to close schools. And I assume the prospect of closing schools being so seismic, correct?
Yeah.
But, I mean, wasn't that the very reason why all governments of the United Kingdom needed to start at a much earlier stage really preparing for the reality of what this would entail?
I think there's I think that's a fair observation, that trying to contemplate how we could slow up the circulation of the virus was an issue that could have helped us to, but could have assisted in that endeavour. But I would make the observation that the period of time before the realisation of the early cases of coronavirus in Scotland and the closure of schools was a very, very short window indeed. So I think I think in the earlier exchanges you indicated to Ms. Dobbin that the first case was identified in Scotland on the 1st of March, I think was what we said. And we made the announcement about the closure of schools on the 18th of March. So it's a relatively short window in which alternative approaches could take place, when in actual fact there were various things being applied to try to avoid the spread of the virus at that time.
Mrs. Swinney, isn't that an entirely artificial approach? Because it was being warned by SAGE from February onwards that mass school closures might be an eventuality in the event that the virus couldn't be controlled in the United Kingdom.
And there were measures being taken to try to ensure that the spread of the virus was interrupted. And I think, as we know from events, those efforts were not effective in stopping the spread of the virus. Hence, we ended up having to face up to the issue of school closures.
Yes, and I'm just going to stay focused on school closures and Scottish Government planning then. And at around this point in time, because obviously we're late in the picture now, aren't we? It's the 9th of March, yes.
I'm not following.
Yes, it is the 9th. Sorry, I'm looking at the...
Sorry, the statement, my apologies. Yes, it's the 9th of March in this.
Yep.
Yes.
And if we look, please, at paragraph 11 of this, which is on page 3. This was the advice, I think, provided to you on that day about the implications of school closures, yes?
That's correct.
But focused on ad hoc closures, not mass school closures, yes? And I think we can say, I won't read out every one of these paragraphs, Mr. Swinney, but this focused on workforce.
Yes.
B, the inability of parents and carers to work.
Yes.
Educational continuity, we see at C. The pandemic and planned interventions could have a significant impact on educational continuity. Yes?
Yes.
And if we read on, that says this will be particularly important for those preparing for and studying exams. Yes? And then at D, a reference to free school meals.
Yes.
And then a bit about teacher qualifications.
Yes.
And then a paragraph on child protection, youth justice and secure care.
Yes.
But I don't think, Mr. Swinney, looking at that in fact relates to school closures. I mean, it doesn't talk about child protection in schools or continuity of child protection within the education system.
Not in that particular paragraph.
No. No. And if we go on and look at then the impact of general school closures, so this is the advice contemplating mass school closures.
Yes.
And it just says the impact of a wider policy of school and early learning closures would be similar to a significant level of ad hoc school closures, with a few differences due to it affecting all families with children equally. Yes?
Yes.
So not imparting any sort of further advice or deep thinking about what mass school closures would entail, correct?
That's correct. I think I'd simply add to that I think that's indicative of the fact that this was not our preferred scenario. We do not want this to happen.
Yes, but Mr. Swinney, not wanting something to happen doesn't mean that you don't grapple with the realities of what it might mean when it does happen. And that must be all the more so when it comes to children's lives.
Well, but which is why I think the issues that are set out in detail on page 3 and page 4 cover the significant issues that are involved in that guidance and advice, because it goes through those implications for children and families.
Do you, Mr. Swinney, do you really consider pages 3 and 4 to be detailed advice on the implications of school closures for most school-aged children in Scotland?
Well, it's rehearsing the issues that have got to be considered and addressed and would be the subject of further work and advice that would arise as a consequence, which is the purpose of the submission to me of the 9th of March.
Yes, this is headline stuff, isn't it? Dealing with the realities of children's lives at best at a superficial level. Do you agree?
No, I don't agree with that. No.
You don't? So when it comes...
I think it's covering the issues that we have got to undertake detailed planning to address the implications of those issues, which we then which consumed all of our time and thinking in wrestling with those challenges.
Sorry, is this the detailed planning that you're referring to? Or was there some other detailed planning going on at around this time?
But I think what this demonstrates, that this is a submission to me from one of my officials, which would be setting out to me the various issues that we had to contemplate and consider as part of the impact of COVID on the sustainability of school education. And that was briefing me in advance of a COBRA call to consider some of these questions on a much wider platform.
So what did you... Sorry,
From that would flow a whole range of follow-up actions that dominated our thinking for some considerable time.
OK, I'm going to come to some of that follow-up action, because I think, in fact, one of the next things that you did, and this was on the 13th of March, was to write to local authorities and schools once again. Correct? I can take you to that letter. It's INQ 000 52 991. So this is the 13th of March. It's a letter, I think it's addressed to schools again and to local authorities. Thank you.
Yeah, it's addressed to local authority chief executives and directors of education who are in the 32 local authority areas in Scotland, and then it's copied to a much smaller, so they will be responsible for the over approximately 3,000 schools in Scotland, and then the independent schools and grant-aided schools to which it's copied are a much smaller cohort of those organisations, and Solace and the Association of Directors of Education are professional bodies for the Directors of Education and local authority chief executives.
I'm grateful to you for clarifying that, Mr. Swinney. If we just look at the bottom two paragraphs of this letter, please. So you have, in the first two paragraphs, to be clear, you've talked about the Four Nations Coronavirus Action Plan and about the Scottish Resilience Partnership writing to local authorities, seeking confirmation that appropriate plans are in place. So that this is what this is referring to. In support of this work, we're writing to set out some key potential impacts of COVID-19 to help you inform your planning activity. These key impacts and some considerations are set out in Annex 1, which we'll come to. And then this, underlined, if you are confident that you have considered these impacts in full, you should indicate this under the relevant developing field in the COVID-19 readiness dashboard that's being returned. If you are confident that appropriate plans are in place, this should contribute to your assessment of readiness under the prepared field. Correct?
Yes.
And then we have at Annex 1 the impacts that are identified. Yes?
Yes.
And again, I'm just going to pick up the second paragraph. Well, let me pick up the first. On the basis of scientific advice, we are currently not recommending widespread school closures for public health reasons. However, this position will be kept under close regular review. Correct?
Right.
And then you go on to say, however, local public health advice or workforce difficulties due to illness, self-isolation of staff, knock-on impacts may result in some schools having to close as a result of COVID-19. Yes?
That's
and then
right.
at the very end of that paragraph, we believe it will be important to have confidence that the following key issues have been considered and addressed. Yes? So,
yes.
I mean, again, Mr. Swinney, the onus being put on local authorities and or schools or the directors of education to inform you about their address of the key issues, correct?
Yes, but that to repeat things I've said already is a reflection of the structure of Scottish education, that there is no operational locus for the government at local level in the determining of these questions. We rely on the interlocutors who are local authorities and their professional leadership through elected members, chief executives and directors of education in that respect. So we are essentially providing support to enable local authorities to come to conclusions about the steps they need to take to prepare for the situations that we're facing and to deal with the operational implications of that.
I think it's really important, Mr. Sweeney, we just nail down what the role of the Scottish Government is, because, I mean, you agreed with me earlier when I asked whether or not it was just a passive bystander to planning. You said that it wasn't a passive bystander, yes?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And you also agreed with me that it had an important role in planning for the continuity of education, yes?
That's correct, yes.
And planning for that is an entirely different concept and different thing from the operational delivery of education, yes?
No, I don't agree with that.
Okay,
no.
well, what's the difference between the two things?
Well, I think because, for example, as Education Secretary, I am not in operational control of a single school in the country. I can't employ a single teacher. I don't employ a single teacher. As Education Secretary, I don't employ a single teacher. I don't have any operational control over a teacher's conduct in the classroom or the actions that they take. I don't take a single decision about the allocation of resources to the core funding of schools other than what the government itself directs for particular purposes directly into schools. So the overwhelming majority of resources in a school are determined by and directed by a local authority. So what we're trying to do here is to create a collaborative framework in which we are working. We are, as the government, ultimately, so I accept ultimate responsibility. I totally accept that ultimate responsibility for education in Scotland, but the operational delivery is dependent on the actions of our local authorities and the leadership of education around the country. What the government is trying to do here is to help those responsible for the operational delivery of education to plan for really challenging circumstances that are likely to be coming our way.
Okay, so we should hold on to two things, I think, from what you're saying. Your role was to help schools in their operational delivery of education. Is that the height of the Scottish Government's responsibilities at this point, Mr. Swinney?
Well, we'll possibly come on to this in talking about the actual decision to close schools, but we are trying to work. If we go back to what I said in my call with Councillor Alison Everson of the 3rd of March, I just get that point, of the 3rd of March, I was indicating that the government was keen to work in a collaborative way with our local authority partners in this really difficult situation. And I would say this is evidence of the government doing exactly that. We are reliant on individual local authorities and individual schools for the delivery of education in local communities, and we are trying to be as supportive as we can in raising the issues and the considerations that have got to be looked at community by community. Now, by the time this letter has been issued on the 13th of March, there has already been an ad hoc school closure issue wrestled with in one part of Scotland, which is in Shetland, which I think was wrestled with or started to be wrestled with on the 9th of March. So we are essentially acknowledging the difficult context in which we're all operating and trying to work together to navigate a way through that.
Mr. Swinney, again, that was a very long answer to a question that I think was quite a short one, which was making sure I had accurately captured what the role of the Scottish Government was in planning for school closures. And I think as I understood your answer, you were saying that it was the role of the Scottish Government to help schools to prepare for school closures. Is that accurate?
I think that's a fair summary, yes.
Right. And when you talk about collaboration, Mr. Swinney, and this being a collaborative effort, all of the focus appears to be on schools telling you what they are doing, as opposed to the Scottish Government providing schools with an idea as to the state of advice, the reality of what school closures might entail, the need for schools to start thinking about the identification of vulnerable pupils, for example, the need for schools to have a digital strategy in terms of identifying children who don't have access to devices, the massive range of things that were going to make the closure of schools such a seismic and difficult eventuality.
Well, I would contend that the advice that was being offered through communications of this type, or the support that was being offered through Education Scotland, who are the education agency that acts on the government's behalf to support local authorities and schools in the development of educational approaches, or the emphasis on the technology platforms that we had in place through GLOW, for example, or eSchool. These were some of the practical measures that were being taken forward to support schools in that endeavour, and to support them in making the preparation should there be an eventuality that we had to close schools.
So I'm just going to come back to this document then, and I think that your description of it as advice, this demonstrating the sort of support and help that the Scottish Government was giving to schools. So if we look at potential key impact 2, knock-on impacts on the ability of carers and parents to work. So you explain to schools that if settings might close, then parents and carers might need to take time off. And then, so there's a single paragraph on that. And then we believe it will be important to have confidence. So we, that's the Scottish Government, yes?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Confidence that the following issue has been considered and addressed. Do local authorities have plans in place to mitigate the potential impact of localised school or early learning and childcare closures on working families, particularly key workers? So again, Mr. Swinney, nothing here to sort of help local authorities to provide them with the sorts of plans that might be needed to mitigate those particular impacts. Yes, you're asking them if they have plans, correct?
Well, in a sense, it's a recognition of the way in which Scottish education is structured, that we rely upon localities to choose the way in which they deliver education. That's the foundation of Scottish education. So we're essentially trying to work with authorities to ensure that they are prepared for these situations.
Yes, but this is a pandemic, Mr. Swinney. This is schools having to pivot to completely change the ways that they provide education and support to almost every child of school age in Scotland. This isn't business as usual, is it?
No, it's not. No, not in the slightest.
Can we look at potential key impact 3, educational continuity? So again, if schools and early learning and childcare settings are required to close due to workforce public health issues, or if pupils are required to self-isolate in accordance with public health advice, there could be impacts on educational continuity for schools. This will be particularly important for those pupils in the senior phase, yes?
Yes.
That's your advice to schools, yes?
That's the advice, yes.
Yes. At present, there is no change to the Public National Qualifications 2020 examination, yes? So that's a bit of an explanation that at that point in time, exams hadn't changed. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And then again, the same wording. We believe it will be important to have confidence that the following key issues have been considered and addressed. Do local authorities have plans in place to ensure the educational continuity for pupils in the event of localised school closures or a requirement for pupils to self-isolate? Yes?
Yes.
So again, this isn't the Scottish Government providing plans, guidance, ensuring consistency across Scotland. You're asking them if they have plans.
Because that's ultimately where, in a situation where there is, at that moment, we are still dealing with a situation that is contemplating the likelihood of localised impacts. Those terms are essentially trying to avoid any inequity for pupils because they, for example, have got to self-isolate or their school individually has got to close. And we are trying to establish that there needs to be protection in place for children and young people in such circumstances. We obviously very shortly thereafter from this, the writing of this note, have to contemplate whole system school closures. And that's a very different scenario altogether.
Okay, I'm going to come on to that. I'm just going to stay with this advice that you were providing to local authorities and schools. If we go over the page, please, to potential key impact for vulnerable children, and then in parentheses, free school meals, underlying health conditions. If schools in early learning and childcare settings are required to close due to workforce public health issues, or if pupils are required to self-isolate in accordance with public health advice, this may result in children who are in receipt of free school meals, including those in early learning and childcare, being unable to attend school. This could have an impact on the welfare of children.
Yes.
Is that the height of the advice being provided about vulnerable children in schools at this stage?
Well, this is set against the established ethos within Scottish education, where across the board we are focusing, and the system is focused on concepts such as getting it right for every child, which is an underpinning of our approach shared between the Scottish Government and local authorities about ensuring that the individual circumstances of individual children are properly and fully considered in the support that's available through the education system. So that is the policy backdrop. That is the context in which schools are operating. And what the government is setting out here is how that established long-standing policy approach will continue to be applied in the changed and challenging circumstances that we were wrestling with.
I just want to, and perhaps this is a good place to end before the adjournment, Mr. Swinney. If we go to paragraph 99 of your statement, and that's at page 30, where you're explaining that it's not to say that I was not acutely aware of the potential and likely impact of the decisions to close schools. And if I follow that down to the final couple of sentences, our joint letter with COSLA sent to all directors of education on the 13th of March 2020 illustrates the depth of our shared knowledge, our shared understanding, of the potential range of impacts, and critically a desire to do everything we could to get on the front foot in terms of preparedness for mitigating those impacts. Is that right, Mr. Swinney, that this letter of the 13th of March, which we've just gone through, is that really what it does, demonstrate the depth of your knowledge and understanding as to the potential ramifications of school closures?
At that moment, I think it does, because I hold to my view that at that moment, we were trying to avoid school closures if we possibly could do. Indeed, I narrate that in my statement, that, and as I said earlier on in my evidence, it was not my preference to close schools. I wanted to avoid that if I possibly could do. So the advice at that moment was focused very much on the implications that we knew at that time of the potential interruption and disruption to education that would be faced by ad hoc closures, for example, because on the 13th of March 2020, it was not at that stage part of my thinking that we would have whole-scale school closures at that time. I was trying to avoid that if I possibly could do.
Mr. Swinney, you've answered, I think, a different question, and you answered again by reference to the fact that you didn't want to close schools. My question was really whether it is correct and that the inquiry should proceed on the basis that this letter of the 13th of March demonstrates your deep knowledge and understanding of the potential implications of closing schools to children, be it ad hoc school closures or general school closures, as at the 13th of March 2020.
Well, I think the letter fulfills that purpose, the purpose for which I've specified it was set out.
Thank you. My lady, is that an appropriate or a good time to have a break?
Certainly. You'll remember, Mr. Swinney, after your experience, we have a break for the stenographer. So I'll see everybody again at 20 past.
Thank you, my lady.
Mr.
Swinney, I wonder if we could pick up the chronology, please, and we'll stay on the 13th of March. We have some emails that were sent on this date, and that's INQ 000 520 437. And if we could go to page 2 where this starts. Sorry, page 2. Oh, thank you. This, it would appear, was an email sent to the then First Minister, yes?
Yes.
And it sets out, you asked for advice as to what steps we have asked local authorities to put in place for school resilience during the outbreak and what assurance we have had that this is being done. This note summarises the current position. So it would appear that the First Minister saw no difficulty in asking local authorities to put things in place in order to support resilience. Is that right?
Yes, that's what we'd expect, yes.
Right. So there isn't, perhaps we're at cross purposes, Mr. Swinney, so the government can ask local authorities to put things in place to support school resilience.
Yes, of course, that's in the substance of my answers.
Right.
Yes.
So you can ask. The issue is that you can't mandate that it's done. Is that the distinction you're trying to draw?
That's exactly right. Like, it's essentially recognising what statute says, which is that the operation of delivery of education in Scotland is delivered by local authorities.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Swinney. I may have misunderstood. I thought you were trying to suggest that it was difficult for the Scottish Government. Just check, we may have lost the chair. Sorry, Mr. Swinney. My lady, may I just check? We lost you for a moment. Oh, and you're on mute. I think I take it from that you didn't miss anything.
Sorry, I turned the camera off because I spilt something.
Okay. Unfortunately, that wasn't apparent to us, but thank you, my lady. So, Mr. Swinney, coming back to this, and I'm grateful for the clarification then, there's no problem about asking. The issue is you can't require it, yes?
Yes.
Thank you. And
forgive me, Mr. Dolan, which is why I've been taking the approach, which is that I was keen to create a collaborative environment, because I felt that we could only, as a community in Scotland, navigate our way through these difficulties if there was a collaborative environment between the government and local authorities, and that's underpinning my approach here and the expectations of the First Minister in the note that you've drawn to my attention.
yes, so just moving on, and she asking what steps had been asked of local authorities. I mean, I'm not going to go back over the note that had just been sent. It wasn't asking for things to be done. It was asking them to essentially provide you with confidence about what the state of their planning was. Yes?
Right.
And if we look at paragraph 1, for example, it sets out as part of regular resilience and business continuity planning purposes, local authorities will have a range of measures in place to deal with the immediate impacts of school closures, and that this might include snowpacks. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And if we just go over the page, please, and then we can pick up the interrelationship between this email and the letter that we've just seen. It sets out we've had regular discussions with, I won't read all of this out, Mr. Swinney, but COSLA Solace and the association, I think that's of education, yes, the Association of Directors of Education, about contingency planning. COSLA's view is that many local authorities will already have well-developed plans in place similar to those seen in Shetland. That's a reference to the outbreak you were talking about, yes? So local authorities will have. That's not a local authorities do have, no?
Correct.
And you hadn't seen any plans by that point, is that also correct?
Other than seeing the practical implementation of the arrangements in Shetland, no, I had not seen plans from every local authority in the country. No, I hadn't.
And that's why we see paragraph 6. However, to gain greater assurance, we've been working to secure agreement from COSLA and the Scottish Resilient Partnership to issue some key potential impact scenarios. And we've just seen those, correct? And if we read down C, to ask what further support they may require.
Correct.
And then it sets out the main potential impacts. And if we go, please, to page 1 of this, it sets out that the First Minister noted and commented that this was very helpful, that she said that COSLA needed to be encouraged to accelerate the planning and consequently gain assurance for us that plans are in place in the event we get to a situation where the general advice to school is to close, potentially for quite a lengthy period. Yes?
Yes.
And then the First Minister is particularly keen to know what plans are in place for remote learning. And again, reference there to what might be done to allow the children of healthcare workers to be looked after. And I think it's right, isn't it, Mr. Swinney, in terms of what plans were in place for remote learning. We've seen reference to you writing to schools to remind them that they had access to GLOW, correct?
Correct.
It doesn't go beyond that, I don't think, but please say if it does.
The other measures that would be in place are the availability of, at that time, eSchool, which was a remote learning proposition that was available, and the support of Education Scotland to assist local authorities and schools. And obviously, at that particular time, we also had a collaborative arrangements in place at regional level within Scotland, which helped with the with work on school improvement, which was a key priority, and some of that impacted ultimately on remote learning.
Mr. Swinney, when did the penny drop with the Scottish Government as to the gravity of the situation and the reality of schools having to close on a long-term basis? When did that crystallise?
I think it would be in the air around about the time of this exchange, around about the weekend of the 14th of March. If I go to the situation that, over the course of that period, culminating in the Cabinet meeting on the 17th of March, we discussed at the Cabinet meeting on the 17th of March the current situation with the pandemic. We were considering what were the right steps to take generally about the situation that we faced and what degree of restrictions might have to come in place. And at that cabinet meeting, I took the view and shared it with colleagues that I was not at that stage. I didn't at that stage believe that, or I wanted to avoid any school closures before the Easter break. I hoped that the Easter break could give us a bit of a firewall in the spread of the pandemic, with the schools not meeting at that time. But that situation changed dramatically over the course of that day, the 17th of March, leading into the 18th of March, when we ultimately took the decision that we couldn't sustain the schools being open for much longer, and indeed made the announcement, which I confirmed to Parliament on the 19th of March, that schools would close on the 20th.
So are you suggesting that it was only on the 17th of March that it crystallised that schools may have to close, and on a long-term basis? Is that right?
I don't think the word crystallised suggests that we weren't thinking about it. We were thinking about it, but we were hoping we could avoid it. Is the best way that I can express it to the inquiry. And because, I remember quite vividly speaking to Cabinet on the morning of the 17th of March and saying, as I've just narrated, that I hoped that we could avoid school closures. But as the day proceeded and as I got more intelligence from around the country and around the education system, it became more apparent to me how difficult it was going to be to sustain the education system because of the incidence of COVID, and also the degree of alarm and concern that there was amongst teachers, families, and amongst children, and the increasing concern that was being represented to me through the education system, that our school system would face challenges in being able to be safely operated with the degree of staff absence, for example, that we were having to contemplate.
Can we pick up that issue then in the advice that was provided to you on the 17th of March 2020? This is INQ 000 256 717. If we could go to page 1, please. So this was advice provided to you about the closure of schools, early learning and childcare settings. We can see that from paragraph 1, yes?
That's correct, yes.
And if we go over the page, and just to pick up the point you've made, it refers, doesn't it, to there being very significant and building pressures in respect of public confidence.
Correct.
Schools finding it difficult to hold the line, being inundated with parental concerns and declining pupil attendance. Yes? Paragraph 8 reflects that there was now a need for decisive action, correct? Yes?
That's correct, yes. Yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to hurry you. And then we've got options for school closures. How can we best protect key interests? I won't read all of this out, Mr. Swinney, but we can see educational continuity, the suggestion there that pupils would be able to go to school in order to complete some of their coursework. I think that relates to exams, doesn't it? Vulnerable children, so recognition here. I think we see a couple of lines down. Many more families may become vulnerable. Redundancies, 0 hours contracts. Yes. About health vulnerabilities as well.
Yes.
Paragraph 11, I think reflection of the line that had been taken to date. Our view is that it must be for local authorities to make the arrangements most suited to their local circumstances. Yes?
Yes.
Most authorities are taking similar approaches, correct?
Correct.
And then we see reference there, some local authorities may struggle to keep their entire school estate open on a partial basis and may wish to make other arrangements, for example, through hubs across groups of schools or supervised activities, correct?
Correct.
And then we come down, I'm going to go to paragraph 12, please. It says, even if we promote a local approach, there are actions we can take at national level to support local authorities in developing and implementing local solutions. Yes?
Correct, yeah.
So promotion of a local approach, correct?
Yes.
But recognition that there was action that could be taken. Yes?
Correct.
And that was action that had not been taken until that point.
Well, it's action that's contemplating a more widespread problem, because essentially the advice up until then has been about ad hoc school closures. What this submission is contemplating is essentially widespread closures. So in the ad hoc arrangements, there would be what would be envisaged, as is narrated in this submission, the availability, as indicated on page 3 of the implementation in Shetland of a hub arrangement. This was a concept that I think, as the documents show, was quite regularly considered to be an approach around the country. So essentially, it was what this advice is indicating is that there are approaches that can be deployed to deal with the situation of a widespread school closure situation. And, for example, the hub arrangement is one that could be utilised, and in fact was utilised in many parts of the country.
Yes, I'll come back to that. I'm just going to go to paragraph 16. And it says, in advance of receiving feedback from local authorities tomorrow, we cannot be certain that appropriate arrangements are under development across all local authorities. The timing and the sequencing of any announcement on school closures is therefore of critical importance. Getting this right could help relieve some of the pressures and anxiety.
Yes.
Yes. And then at paragraph 18, on balance, we believe that an early announcement is needed. Our judgment is that in view of building public pressure, it's highly unlikely we will be able to keep schools open until the Easter holiday. Yes?
Yes.
And then I don't think I need to go through the rest of this, but it deals with the fact that you didn't have a legal power to close schools, but that wasn't going to stop, was it? You, in fact, making a decision or asking schools to close, correct?
That's correct, yes.
So, Mr. Swinney, is the reality of all of this that on the 17th of March, the Scottish Government did not have a plan for school closures? There wasn't a document that set out any sort of planning or guidance, was there, to schools as to how they should or how they could, or asking them to do anything in terms of the maintenance of education for children?
I would contend that the various submissions and communications to directors of education that we have considered so far are the documents that demonstrate what we were contributing as advice and guidance to the school system to deal with an unprecedented set of circumstances, whilst respecting the fact that statutory responsibility for the delivery of education lay with local authorities across 32 local authority areas in Scotland. Now, what we faced ultimately on the 17th, 18th of March, and perhaps if I could explain the arrangements around about powers, on the arrangements for the closure of a school, the power lies with a local authority to close a school. That invariably in history in Scotland, that's been mainly about weather-related incidents or about perhaps a public health outbreak in an individual locality, maybe a norovirus outbreak or something of that type. And the powers are very localised in that respect. So a director of public health can make can take a decision to close a school based on public health issues. A local authority can close a school because it's difficult to access because of weather issues. When it comes to, as we found out on COVID, when it comes to a national closure programme, the powers did not exist on the 17th of March 2020 for that to be undertaken. Hence why I'd invested so much time in creating a collaborative environment with local authorities, so that when it came to the point where somebody had to say the schools are going to have to close, there would not be a body of opinion saying we don't agree with that, because we built up the agreement to get to that point, which I recognised was unavoidable by the time we got to the 18th of March.
Mr. Swinney, by the 17th of March, parents and families were voting with their feet, weren't they? We've already seen that referred to in this advice to you. Schools were finding it hard to hold the line, correct?
That's correct.
And the Scottish Government hadn't done anything before that point in order to stop it reaching this point, had it?
Well, I think we'd set out the guidance that we'd set out, but there was increasing public alarm about the situation, which we had to respond to.
So just coming back to these points, the Scottish Government had plans as reflected in the letters we have been through. Is that your position? These are the plans, correct?
Right, yeah.
And you didn't know what plans local authorities had in place because you hadn't actually seen them, had you?
No, but I was respecting the statutory duty of local authorities to prepare for the continuity of education at local level.
Yes, but Mr. Swinney, you would want to see, wouldn't you want to have some idea as to what those plans looked like, and to ensure that children in Scotland were going to actually have continuity of education and child protection arrangements, wouldn't you?
Yes, and I would contend that I was exercising my duty to do that, but I was also doing that in a way that was respectful of the statutory right of local authorities to deliver education at local level. And there would be significant, in putting this into context, there is a very careful and delicate balance that is pursued. It has to be pursued by education ministers in Scotland who, as I've said on a number of occasions already this afternoon, carry ultimate responsibility for the delivery of education in Scotland, but the operational delivery is, by statute, the responsibility of local authorities. So I didn't feel I could, I felt I had to respect the statutory arrangements that were in place in Scotland in all of that preparatory period. I was keen to nurture a collaborative environment with local authorities to make sure that we could navigate our way through an incredibly difficult set of judgments at that time.
And you had no certainty, did you, as to what appropriate arrangements were under development across all local authorities in Scotland? That's correct, isn't it?
I was aware that, as the documentation that's in front of us indicates, that local authorities would be having discussions amongst the local authority community about some of the models for educational continuity, which would include concepts such as the hub arrangement that had been put in place in Shetland in early March.
I'm going to come to the hub arrangements, Mr. Swinney, but do you accept that you made the decision, and I'm putting to one side the issue as to whether you had the power. You don't dispute, do you? You came to a decision that schools had to close, yes?
I came to that conclusion, yes.
And did you come to that conclusion effectively blind to what the state of planning was across Scotland for that eventuality?
I wouldn't say blind, but I felt I also had no alternative but to announce the closure of schools.
Yes, and you had no alternative, and you ended up in this position, didn't you? Because you hadn't taken effective steps at an earlier stage to start planning for this prospect.
I've rehearsed with the inquiry this afternoon that the steps that we were taking in a relatively short space in time were steps working in partnership with local authorities to address an unprecedented set of circumstances.
Have you reflected in retrospect, Mr. Swinney, why you didn't act on the information that was available from SAGE from February 2020 onwards in order to put in place or to take more effective steps so that planning was at a more advanced stage by the time you made the announcement or the decision to close schools?
Well, I was trying to focus on the sustainability of education was my priority. I did not want to take steps to move to school closures. And then in relation to the question about SAGE's advice and the advice that was sent to me on the 17th of March by the director of the Learning Director in the Scottish Government, in paragraph 4, it says, we understand that SAGE is now expected to recommend on Thursday that school closure is the appropriate course of action. So up until that moment, the word now is critical in that statement, that up until then, SAGE had not been recommending school closures as the appropriate action.
Why is it critical, Mr. Swinney? School closures had been contemplated by SAGE in February. We've already rehearsed that. You weren't going to wait until they actually recommended it to start doing any planning, were you? I mean,
Education was not operating in a compartment of its own. It was operating within the wider suite of public policy, where we were trying to avoid the situation where the spread of the virus would become so widespread that it would require us, as we eventually found ourselves in on the 18th of March, having to take a decision to close schools, because, as all of our communication indicates, the closure of schools was an element of the process that we regretted the most and wanted to avoid the most.
But none of that precluded you from starting to put in detailed planning in order to deal with the ramifications of closing schools, did it?
And what I've rehearsed with the inquiry this afternoon is that we were taking steps to work collaboratively with our local authorities who are responsible for the delivery of education at local level. And if I'd started on the 27th of February by issuing directives about what schools had to do and what schools hadn't to do beyond what I was doing, I think I would have had a quite significant backlash from the local authority community in Scotland. And I was intent on working, given the gravity of the situation, in a collaborative way with local authorities to try to address these issues.
Mrs. Swinney, I'm going to move on then to one of the elements of the Scottish Government's policy. And I think this is an area where the Scottish Government did provide guidance, and this relates to its vulnerable children policy, yes?
Yes.
And you did provide guidance, didn't you, to help local authorities identify those children who should be able to attend hub schools, yes?
I did, yes.
And that policy, it didn't work, did it? Insofar as the number of children who attended those schools was extremely low indeed.
Well, we were providing support in a number of different ways. Some of that was through the education system, where I think in summary I would characterise it as hub arrangements were in place in different on a fairly extensive basis around the country, a very extensive basis around the country. And then there was also the support that was being provided through our public services in the support to families in the home to support vulnerability in a variety of different ways. And that would be through the intervention of social work staff and the provision of wider financial food and service support to families in their own homes.
I'm just focusing on hub schools for a moment, Mr. Swinney. Those had been set up to enable the children of critical workers and vulnerable children to attend, yes?
That's correct, yes.
And what was the purpose of drawing up criteria so that vulnerable children could attend that provision?
To make available that option to ensure that we could support families that were facing vulnerability, but it was not the only intervention to support families with vulnerabilities.
No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm just asking why there was specific provision made for those children so that they could go somewhere other than being in their homes.
It was essentially to recognise the vulnerability of those children and to support them as effectively as we could.
It was a safeguarding measure, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, yes.
And it was a safeguarding measure for the obvious reason that children who are at risk in their home would be better being somewhere else where they're safe and looked after by other adults, correct?
Correct, but it wasn't the only safeguarding measure in place.
No. And insofar as that was one of your policy interventions, I accept there may have been others, do you accept that it failed because of the very low number of children who made use of that provision, but in particular, the very low number of children from vulnerable families who used it?
No, because there were other interventions available that were regularly reported upon to ministers.
So it doesn't matter then that children took up the places at such a low level? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying there were other interventions that were available.
I'm going to go to, if I may, to INQ 000651635. This is a presentation from Scottish Women's Aid. You've set out the figures, Mr. Swinney, in your statement as to the numbers of children who attended, so I'm not going to take you through that. But if we look, please, at page 6 of this document. Fewer than 4.5% of children and young people with multi-agency plans accessing the hubs. Processes for school spaces patchy across Scotland. We see at the bottom only 30% of women's aid groups reported being able to make referrals for vulnerable children and young people to school spaces through a local process. Page 7. I think it says at the top they also had difficulty in getting access to them for their own staff. And goes on to explain that despite its ties with the local Violence Against Women partnership, not approached or made aware of discussions regarding spaces for vulnerable children and young people. And then we can read on. Due to internal council confusion as to where responsibility sat regarding vulnerable children accessing spaces, the situation did not change for the entirety of lockdown. There were available spaces in the hubs throughout the lockdown period. And if we may, over the page 10, please. Sorry, it's page 10, forgive me. Patchy local provision of school spaces for children living with domestic abuse and the lack of engagement with specialist support services delivered an outcome, the failure to protect some of the most vulnerable children in Scotland. Mr. Swinney, do you accept that? Do you accept that the reality on the ground was that children who could have done with being out of their homes and in a hub and kept safe were failed?
I obviously very much respect the evidence put forward by Scottish Women's Aid, but I think there are other interventions, as I have talked about, that were available to provide assurance on the fulfilment of child protection issues. So there was regular reporting which the Chief Social Work Advisor in the Scottish Government presided over, engaging with local authorities about the contact with families, and there was also interaction with Police Scotland on this information as well, in providing a picture of the degree to which children that were living in, children in a child protection situation were being properly supported. But if these conclusions from Scottish Women's Aid are difficult to refute, despite the other data that I had available to me during the pandemic.
But Mrs. Swinney, aren't they making a really obvious point, putting aside the data? First of all, that school is of critical importance to vulnerable children because it is the place they go to for safety, where they are observed, taken care of, offered support, yes?
Yes.
And no amount of social work or contact with a family can help to replicate that, can it?
I wouldn't take that view. I think there are other interventions that can be made available to try to protect children. I accept that a primary objective of our approach has got to be to make sure children are well supported in school. I'd always want that to be the case. That's why I was so reluctant to close schools at any stage. But in the context of the situation we faced, there were a range of interventions, one of which was the hubs, but others were the interaction of social work and local authority personnel and third sector organisations that were working extensively to support families in their own homes.
I'm going to move on, Mr. Swinney, to the separate issue of exam assessment. This issue relates, doesn't it, to the decisions that were made about the assessment of children in 2020, the assessment of all of those children in Scotland who would have been doing public examinations, correct?
Right.
And on the 18th of March 2020, you commissioned the Scottish Qualifications Authority to arrive at a process of assessment for those children who were going to sit those public exams. Is that right?
Yeah.
And at paragraph 179 of your statement, this is on page 49, you say the SQA went on to develop a model based on the principles of fairness to all learners, the safe and secure certification of qualifications in accordance with public health advice, the maintaining of integrity and credibility, and ensuring that standards were maintained over time in the interests of learners. The model developed didn't achieve any of those things, did it?
The model was designed to achieve those objectives, and as I narrate in my statement later on, the model essentially demonstrated the delivery of an exam, a set of exam results that were consistent with the principle of maintaining standards, and which demonstrated an improvement in the attainment of learners from deprived backgrounds and the closure of the attainment gap within our education system. But what the exam guide did not do was deliver the estimates that had been put in place by teachers, and that was the issue that I had ultimately to confront in the aftermath of the publication of the exam results.
Have you read the Priestley report, Mr. Swinney?
I have, yes.
Well, maybe we'll come to that to see what the Priestley report said, but do you disagree with the findings of the Priestley report?
I accepted the findings of the Priestley report.
Okay, but we'll come and look at that in a second. You set out at paragraph 183 of your statement, part of a press release that was set out by the SQA. I think I can take this fairly quickly, but it's right, isn't it, that the bit you you haven't quoted all of it, but I don't think this is controversial, that what they explained was that schools and colleges would provide estimates of the grade bands and rank order for each learner for each of the courses at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. Yes? That was part, you understood that was part of the approach to moderation that would be taken, yes? And I think at paragraph 184, you set out the update that you were provided with by the SQA. And it explains, thank you. And I think we can see it, it's about 4 paragraphs down. Prior attainment data, yes, thank you. Prior attainment data is not also available. This means we will not use a purely statistical approach to moderation, correct? Did that ring any alarm bells with you when they said that it wouldn't be purely statistical?
I don't think it did, no.
And you didn't ask any questions about how this model would work or how it would moderate children's assessed grades?
I think it's important to recognise the way in which our approach to examination is undertaken in Scotland. That essentially the conducting of the examination system is undertaken at arm's length from the government by the Scottish Qualifications Authority. So, and my view in all of this was that having taken a decision which I felt I had to take, given the nature of the pandemic, to say that the exam diet could not go forward, I had to enable the Scottish Qualifications Authority to deliver an exam diet to the best of their ability, recognising the importance, which I think was highlighted in some of the earlier material, in a way that would maintain standards within the education system so that young people could have confidence in the qualifications that they had achieved.
So it is actually your short answer, Mr. Swinney. No, I didn't ask any questions about it.
Well, it's essentially, it's the, I was respecting the arrangements that we have in place, which is that there is an arm's length system for the undertaking of our examination approach in Scotland, and not one dictated or directed by ministers.
And is asking questions about how grades are going to be arrived at, is that dictating an outcome?
No, but I would have had dialogue with the SQA about these issues, but I can't recall any particular discussions that we've had. So
what about when concerns were raised directly with you in mid-July 2020 by Johan Lamont? I understand he's a member of the Scottish Parliament. If you need a reminder of that.
It's actually Joanne Lamont.
Forgive me. We have that at INQ 000182832, and just so that we can be clear, this is the Priestley report. That was commissioned by you, wasn't it, Mr. Swinney, after this arose? And if we could look at page 25, please. So we can see, if we just read from the top, that you were sent a letter in July dealing with, or detailing comments that had been made by constituents, yes?
Yes, I see that, yes.
And explaining that one of the ways that, and I'm paraphrasing, Mr. Swinney, that moderation would be undertaken was that pupils' grades would be changed to ensure attainment in line with the prior attainment of that centre, yes? And making the point that this would disproportionately punish schools in the most deprived communities, yes?
Yes.
So this is drawn to your attention in mid-July, correct?
Yes.
And this isn't any sort of complicated issue about an algorithm, is it? What's being pointed out to you is a principled problem with the approach that was going to be taken, correct?
I think that's a way of describing it, yes.
And it would appear that Miss Lamont's constituents were able to point out this problem to you. Yes?
Yes, but I think if going back to the point that was made earlier about the communication from the SQA, I think it was far from certain that that would be the case, or that could not be demonstrated at that time.
So can I be clear about this? Did you raise this concern with the SQA? Did you say, look, ordinary people are pointing out there's a problem with the approach you're taking? Can you tell me about it?
I don't recall doing that because I was taking the view that I had essentially commissioned the SQA to undertake the design of an alternative certification model and to make sure that all of the principles that we rehearsed earlier on around about fairness, about the delivery of reliable qualifications, about the reflection of attainment, that the SQA would be operating to fulfil that mandate.
So you're a bystander, essentially. People can tell you there's a problem here, and you can do nothing about it. Is that right?
I wouldn't characterise it as that. It's respecting the fact that there is an approach taken in Scotland, which was that we should have qualifications certificated by an external body, and that external body should apply professional judgment to enable that to be undertaken in the interests of fairness to all learners.
I'll come back to fairness, if I may, Mr. Swinney, but what Dr. Priestley, I think it is, goes on to explain is what the constituents of Miss Lamont had pointed out was that this outcome might have been anticipated. And Dr. Priestley goes on to explain why that was likely to happen at paragraphs 1 and 2, correct?
Yes.
And then he goes on to explain in the following paragraphs what it was that went wrong with the model that was adopted. And I think the line or the description that he uses on a number of occasions in this report is that it's arbitrary, correct?
Correct.
And do you understand why he regards it or thought that it had arbitrary elements?
I understand why Professor Priestley takes that view, yes.
And sorry, is that a view you disagree with?
No, I can see why that view has justification.
And and I'm just going to point to some of the evidence he points out also for this, if we could look at page 26. Sorry, page 25. Yes, page 26, sorry, by the I&Q reference. Thank you. So in this second paragraph here, he's explaining, isn't he, some of the evidence that had been presented by schools as to what had happened. So although the 2020 grade distribution at the level of schools broadly resembled historical grade distributions, there were huge variations between the 2020 results and the historical trends for some subjects. And he goes on, doesn't he, to say that there were many candidates whose grades were moderated down in an apparently arbitrary way.
Sorry, are we on the right page?
Yes, forgive me, I'm looking at my hard copy. It's the second paragraph down. Some schools presented. So it picks up, there were huge, forgive me. And goes on to point out, doesn't it, conversely, mediocre students in high-performing schools may be unduly rewarded with higher than their estimated grades. And he goes on to say that whilst the latter problem was far less discussed in the media than the former one, that many teachers felt very strongly about that as well. Yes?
Yes.
So this is what, and in fact what the entire tenor, I think, of this report, Mr. Swinney, suggests is that this is about unfairness at the level of the individual child, correct?
Right.
And if we go on, thank you, there were also problems, weren't there? So problem one was the issue that had been drawn to your attention in July. Problem two was that there was no equalities assessment, correct? For a very considerable period of time.
It was undertaken, but as part of the exercise, but not at the earliest moment.
Now, if we could pick up, please, on page 33. And it's the paragraph, second one down, that begins moreover. And if we read a few lines down, concerns about the absence of an equalities impact assessment were raised as early as May by the Scottish Parliament. At this point, the Deputy First... I'm skipping down a couple of lines, Mr. Swinney. At this point, the Deputy First Minister stated that it was a matter for the SQA. Yes, so you... Second problem, but that's a matter for the SQA as well, is that right?
That's consistent with the view that I've expressed to you, that this was, I had commissioned the Scottish Qualifications Authority to design an alternative certification model to replace exams, and it was essentially I was respecting that independence of judgment to be applied by the SQA, given the principles that I had set out that had to be undertaken.
So that's problem two. If we go over the page, please, to page 34. Thank you. Problem three was that the SQA were in serious difficulties about doing an equalities assessment. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
Because they didn't actually have access to any of the data that you would need in order to be able to do an equalities assessment. They didn't have data about the protected characteristics of the children who were doing the exams. Yes?
Great.
So that's problem three. And they approached the government about that, didn't they?
That's correct, yes.
And what did you do about that?
From my recollection, I think we made analytical support available, I think, to the SQ, but I'm not certain about that.
Well, I think from reading the Priestley report, the decision was taken that the Scottish Government couldn't take pre-moderation data and apply or, as I understand it, provide the data. So, I mean, the Priestley report suggests that that couldn't be done.
I can't recall the detail of that.
It says two alternative approaches to this analysis were not subsequently possible. I'm looking at page 33, thank you. SQA's view was that they could not take receipt of equalities data from the government, and the government deemed that it could not take analysis prior to the results day, and that this might be seen as an unwarranted interference in the workings of an independent exams regulator.
Okay, I'm grateful for the reminder of that point, but I can recognise and understand both of those points.
So, problem with the fairness of the model brought to your attention in July, correct?
Yes.
Absence of an equalities impact assessment drawn to your attention in May, yes?
Right.
Criticism in this report that that analysis wasn't carried out until the last moment. You might recollect that, Mr. Swinney.
Yeah, certainly later in the
Yes.
process.
And then an equality impact assessment that couldn't be effective because there wasn't a way to resolve the problem with the data that would have been needed to do it. Is that correct? And still, could you not intervene or discuss or suggest how this was going to be resolved?
I don't think all of those issues would have crystallised until a very, very late stage in the exam process, and indeed in the information that was shared with me in advance of the publication of the exam results, which would be a matter of days. The exam results would have come out on Tuesday the 4th of August, and days before that, on the 30th of July, I would have been given a briefing on the contents of the exam results. And what that showed was that young people in the lowest Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation bandings were not adversely affected by the revision of the estimates. So in the information available to me, that was what was presented to me on the 30th of July.
Should we just look at that? If we look at page 34 of the Priestley report, and if we look, please, at the paragraph that begins the circumstances outlined above. So those are all of the circumstances that Dr. Priestley has described in the report. Seem to have led to a situation where some of the impacts of the moderation model were not fully anticipated or mitigated. We have, for example, found little evidence in email communications between or public statements by the SQA and the government that the equity nuances had been anticipated or publicly acknowledged, even fully understood, prior to the furore that erupted after the publication of results. Emails, for example, those sent internally on the 4th of August, suggest a government priority to defend the position that the system is fair on low, I think that's socially, economically disadvantaged student, in the face of accusations that low ES centres were more likely to have had their awards downgraded, e.g. emails about suggested lines of argument to justify the position. Within this dichotomous argument, some implications were clearly grasped. And it goes on to say, but the focus of this, combined with a lack of systematic statistical analysis at a fine ingrained level, seems to have obscured other effects. That's essentially what you're trying to do in this inquiry, it seems, Mr. Swinney, is to carry on with the line that somehow the way that these results were produced isn't that bad, because of the discrepancies or because of the disadvantage gap. Is that correct?
How I would characterise it is that the general position that was presented to me in the normal fashion of a minister hearing about the exam results, which is to be briefed a matter of days beforehand with no prior knowledge of the contents of the exam results, that there had been a situation where pupils in the most deprived areas had increased in their pass rate at a sharper rate than those in the least deprived areas, and there had been a narrowing of the attainment gap. But what followed from the publication of the exam results was a demonstration of a much greater degree of adverse impact on young people in the difference between the estimates that had been supplied by their teaching centres and the outcome of the exam results, and that essentially presented a picture of disadvantage that concerned me in the aftermath of the exam results being published, and concerned public opinion and parliamentary opinion into the bargain.
At paragraph 189 of your statement, Mr. Swinney, and this is on page 52, you carry on, thank you, the line, and we can read this from the top, on results day, some of the real life impacts of the outcomes became clear, and you again restate there that the pass rate amongst pupils in the most deprived areas had increased at a sharper rate. I think that the point that Dr. Priestley was critical of, there had been that schools in areas of higher deprivation had been downgraded more than schools in more affluent areas. This left many young people feeling that their future had been determined by statistical modelling. It wasn't a feeling, was it, Mr. Swinney? That is what had happened to them. Do you accept that?
I do, yes.
Right. And at the end of all of this, you did direct the SQA to reissue grades based solely on teacher judgment, didn't you?
I did, yes.
So you were able to issue a direction which corrected the position, but only after the prediction that was made by the constituents came to pass, correct?
Correct.
And you had an opportunity to reflect on this in your statement. If we could go to paragraph 200 on page 54, please. Sorry, that's page 54. 200. I have reflected on the events following the cancellation of the exam diet in March many times. And your reflections set out at page 201. I won't read that out, Mr. Swinney, but what it seems to amount to is your view that it was an opportunity to move away from an over-reliance on exams to determine the future of young people. There's absolutely no reflection there, is there, on the consequences that this disaster over exams had for young people?
Well, I reflect on that, I think, in other aspects of my statement, where I made clear that I recognised that we had, I had to, it was necessary for me to offer a direct apology to the pupils whose teacher estimates had been higher than their final award, at paragraph 195, and I set out, so I offered that direct apology to pupils and I rectified the situation.
Didn't the Children's Commissioner of Scotland have to write to you after you issued that apology because you said something in a BBC interview that seemed to entirely undermine it?
I don't recall that, but I offered the direct apology to the young people of Scotland in a statement to the Scottish Parliament on the official record, and that is obviously a very open and long-standing statement of the regret and the apology that I felt about the distress that was caused to young people at that time.
I'm going to move on then, if I may. There are some questions that core participants have asked Mr. Swinney. And first of all, I'm just going to go back in time a bit. Section 16 of the Coronavirus Act made specific provision for Scotland, didn't it? It enabled Scotland to effectively, or gave a power so that local authorities didn't have to comply with certain duties. Do you recollect that?
I do, yes.
So you could disapply duties in respect of preparing a young carer's statement, regulations dealing with the identification of carers' outcomes and the need for support. Yes?
Yes.
The duty to assess the needs of a child affected by disability, correct?
Correct.
Those sorts of statutory duties. Can I just ask, in terms of the supervision of that, or supervision of how those relaxations had been used, did the Scottish Government take up data from local authorities so that it could interrogate the extent to which those relaxations had been exercised?
I think if the inquiry was looking for a tabular assessment on each of those factors, I think the answer would have to be no. But what the what the government was provided with by local authorities was information about engagement with families where there were vulnerabilities or where there were child protection circumstances, which was data that was collated by the Chief Social Work Advisor to the government and was the subject of, Chief Social Work Advisor has a lifetime of career in child protection and child support, and it would have been the subject of interaction with local authorities about the delivery of those of that support. So, in an assessment of engagement with families that where children face vulnerabilities, then the answer to that question would be yes.
Right, but not a sort of systematic oversight as to how statutory relaxations were being used. I think that's quite a simple question, Mr.
I would contend in a general sense, then yes, that information was available to the government because of the data that was provided to us by the Office of the Chief Social Work Advisor.
All right. In your statement at paragraphs 445 to 456, you set out evidence about the use of remote education and how it became more effective in the second set of school closures.
Yes.
Do you consider that remote education has a place in future options for educating children and young people outside its role as an emergency measure, or indeed as part of an emergency measure?
As a complement to face-to-face learning, yes.
Thank you. And just this, one of the approaches that the Scottish Government took, Mr. Swinney, was to allow children to ask questions of the First Minister. Is that right? In other words, children were allowed to speak to her, I think, directly and to ask her questions.
I can't. Well, certainly there are various opportunities where we have interaction. Very shortly, the Cabinet will meet with representatives of the Children's Parliament and the Scottish Youth Parliament, and that's been a habitual part of our work. I'm not familiar with other direct engagement, but the inquiry may have information on that.
All right. It was more about the importance to the Scottish Government of being able to hear from children directly, Mr. Swinney.
Well, that's my point about the interaction that we have with the Cabinet, for example, meets on an annual basis with representatives of the Children's Parliament and the Scottish Youth Parliament, and the former First Minister and myself as current First Minister engage actively with children and young people on a regular basis. I was at a discussion with children and young people just week before last on the cost of the school day. So there are various opportunities for that interaction to take place.
Thank you. My lady, I think there is a question from a core participant.
There are two, I think. Miss Hannett first, please, for long COVID kids.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Swinney, I appear on behalf of Long COVID Kids and Long COVID Kids Scotland. I'm going to show you two documents on the screen and then ask you a question about those documents. The first is INQ 000470032, page 3, please. I don't know if that's being put up, my lady. Brilliant, thank you very much. It's page 3. Mr. Swinney, this is an internal email exchange with the Scottish Government at the end of July 2021. And you'll see on the page that's on the screen just below the sort of main email that you can see below, Hi Orlando. You'll see that it sets out the First Minister is concerned that we seem to be taking decisions based on a view that COVID is not a serious risk to children when there still seems to be a lot of scientific disagreement on risks of, for example, long COVID. That's the first document. The second document is INQ 000530236, page 2, please. And that's an email exchange in late July, early August 2021 discussing the removal of all non-pharmaceutical interventions for children under the age of 2. Page 2, you can see that I think the fifth paragraph down, commencing the other part setting out that if those NPIs are removed, that could mean tolerating a high rate of prevalence within children. Mr Sweeney, do you agree that the Scottish Government's subsequent decision to remove all MPIs for children under 12 left a significant number of children at greater risk of developing long COVID?
I don't agree with that course of act. I don't agree with that assessment, in the sense that I think there were a whole host of steps being taken to try to support young people and to protect their health and well-being through some wider interactions of the health and care system. But obviously, I'm to go back to the first message. I'm obviously concerned about the experience of long COVID and the issues that young people would face.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms. Hannett. Mr. Broach.
Thank you, my lady. Mr Sweeney, I have a question for you for the children's rights organisations, and it's on a similar point. We know that Scotland adjusted the rules on social distancing and inter-household mixing during the pandemic to take account of the interests of children. For example, from the 3rd of July 2020, those under 12 were exempted from social distancing requirements and then later exempted from all the rules on inter-household mixing in September 2020. Why did Scotland do this? And do you think it was, on balance, the correct decision which benefited children overall?
I think it was the correct decision, because we were constantly concerned about the impact of COVID on the well-being of children, and I mean in that the widest sense of the concept. And we were concerned that children needed to have access to interaction and engagement in family and friendship situations, and we believed that children and young people were suffering significantly. And as I have set out in my statement, we took a rights-based approach to all of these questions. We were, of course, around about the same time contemplating the incorporation of the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child into domestic Scots law. So we were very much thinking about these perspectives as we considered those issues.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Broach. Mr. Sweeney, First Minister, I'm sure you'll be relieved to know that that is the end of the demands this inquiry, the UK inquiry, will make on you. I have no idea what the Scottish inquiry demands they may make. But thank you very much indeed for all the help you've given to the inquiry and for all the time, given all your other responsibilities. And now you can get back to them. So thank you again.
Thank you.
My lady.
Sorry, we've got some other matters, yep.
Yes, my lady, that concludes the evidence for week 2 of Module 8. But with your permission, we'll also adduce into evidence a number of witness statements relative to the evidence you've heard this week. And there they are, with their I&Q numbers. Relevant to education, health and social care and online harms. These include statements from the UK Government, the Local Government Association and the Welsh Government Association, as well as a number of unions, charities and non-governmental organisations. And my lady will also publish the addendum expert report on long COVID by Dr Terry Siegel and Dr Elizabeth Whittaker.
Very well, they may be published, thank you. Well, that completes the evidence session for this week, and we shall return at 10:30 next Monday. Can't work out what the date is. 13th of October, I think. And we shall sit at 10:30. And I shall be attending the Hearing Centre. Thank you all very much indeed.